officially live. I'm so excited to dive into another pre-symposium panel. So a pre-symposium panel is a gathering of executives who are going to be at our upcoming Executive Symposium. In this case, we're talking about the Executive Symposium on February 12th, 2026 in the Austin area. It'll actually technically be at the Round Rock Express baseball field. So we'll be overlooking the stadium. It'll be a really cool space for the event from 5 to 8 p.m. But we're here to talk about change without burnout, balancing innovation, stability, and team capacity. And so at the pre-symposium panel, which we're going through today, we're going to be discussing with three leaders who are going to be at the event, their thoughts, their experiences, their insights on how they've been able to achieve change while still being able to keep morale high, to, keep capacity satiated and, not overwhelm the team and be able to keep them going with the same amount of excitement for the work as they were when they were doing the previous thing that they were doing. So anyways, we've got three great leaders with us here today. We've got Dean, we've got Suzanne, and we've got Amanda. Dean, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Dean Bruce, leadership, been a key thing for like the last 25 years. Recently took some time off to write a book called The Empathetic Edge, where we focus on empathy as it pertains to leadership and that it's not necessarily a normalized structure within the leadership construct. Yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Garrett.
Of course. Suzanne, how about you?
Hey Garrett, Suzanne Grover. I live here in Austin, Texas, and I've got 25 years in financial services. I am the VP of Underwriting and Operations for a major general agency for kind of large life insurance carriers. So a lot of change, always. And also am one of the people that's subscribed to Ambition in Motion and just really enjoying the value you provide, Garrett.
Thanks, Suzanne. And Amanda, how about you?
Sure. I'm Amanda Thompson Buffington. I'm one of the co-founders and managing partners at Hopefully Marketing Group. I've been in the recruitment, marketing, employer branding space for now going on 25 years, but now own my own agency and support global companies hiring. So happy to be here, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
I love that. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder and CEO of Ambition in Motion. Our vision's a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality, and when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders because leaders create the experiences that employees have while at work. And so we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways that we build community is through executive symposiums. So let's dive in. Topic is change without burnout, balancing innovation, stability, and team capacity. The first question I want to kick off with revolves around, I guess, maybe unrealistic optimism when it comes to implementing a change, because that's something that I see quite often happening within the workforce. We'll see a scenario where an executive team says, we're changing directions, we're going off in this direction. And everyone's like, huzzah, we're going in a new direction. And, I think the executive team hopes that the rest of the organization has as much excitement around this change initiative as they do, and also capacity to just drop everything they were working on and immediately move in this new direction. But the reality is that there are loose ends that need to be tied up before anybody can drop their previous work and move on to this new thing. Also, more often than not, maybe there's not a full awareness as to like all the things that the rest of the team does to keep the lights on and keep the business like churning along and chugging. And so when you make this new strategic change, like don't get me wrong, exciting, love, love, love it, but there's not a conscientious awareness as to the that is necessary that needs to be given to the employees so then they can mentally transition into this new change. So the first question I have is, what do you find is a great kind of starting point for setting expectations both with employees and with the executive team as to what to expect in terms of the timeline in which change will be implemented?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I've tried to do over the course of the last few years, especially when it comes to this, is I run into a lot of businesses that in a sense have change fatigue, right? Where they're changing so often that the business is really excited about going the first time, maybe the second time, but the third time, fourth year in a row, that starts to kind of fatigue them out. So we try to make sure that when we're making changes, where I'm at is that we're anchoring those changes in meaning before mechanics, right? We want to make sure that the business understands the why behind why we're making this change and why it's important to adjust. For example, one of the big things right now is AI. And so a lot of the businesses are changing their load balance to try to focus in on how they can use that technology. And so really taking time to explain how that operationally works for us has really helped to get the teams to understand so that they can buy into it as well and move on before that. So having that purpose and value behind it is really what impacts the people that are on the ground doing the work every day.
I think Dean's got a really good point. There's two things, right? It's kind of the amount of change and the pace of change, right? And then the communication of said change. And I've been guilty of being overly enthusiastic about something, an initiative we're pushing because, and even if I do a great job communicating it well to the staff, you still have to be really cognizant of what work is going to be replaced by the change, because otherwise what I've seen happen is the high performers end up with the old processes, the new processes, the learning curves, and kind of secondarily having to lead through the change with the lower performers. And that's where I've seen the burnout happen is it's even if it's communicated well, it's the pace of the change, not necessarily the content of the change, even if it's for the greater good and everybody can kind of get behind it.
Yeah, so to add to that, so the why, right, that's important. And then what does it mean for me personally in my role? And then what does success look like? Not 6 months ago, but right now and in 6 months. So how am I going to be measured? And something that I think is really important with change coming to organizations, especially with the rise of AI, we're all seeing that. You know, why not get some of your team to help with a pilot group, get some feedback loops so that you have some of that feedback before it's launched with the larger team and get their feedback before that so that you can go to market, if you will, with those changes internally. And then you already have some of that feedback and you can address it with the larger team.
Mm. You all bring up really great points around this concept of change fatigue and the awareness around it. And I want to ask, especially if y'all have seen scenarios, whether you've been in this scenario or you've seen or observed scenarios, but sometimes when we bring in a new executive, it's almost like adding a new head chef to the kitchen.
Mm.
And that head chef, their preconceived notion is like, I'm here to shake things up. The board didn't bring me on to, they didn't fire the previous person and bring me on. So then like to keep doing the same old thing that we've been doing. So even though chicken was on the previous menu and chicken's like going to be on my new menu, all the current chicken in our stock has to be thrown out because it needs to be sourced from my personal vendors. And what I'm making an analogy here, but where I'm going within all of this is there's oftentimes not a conscientiousness as to how much change the people who will be enacting the change, in this case, line cooks, have been through from the previous cook into you as the new head chef. And even though you might be a really good, empathetic, curious leader who cares about their people, they don't know that. So how can you get that message across to your team, especially when you feel the pressure to change things up per the reason why the board hired you in the first place?
I think that goes back to my point about piloting groups. Burnout really spikes when the change is done to people instead of with them. So if they don't feel included in the process, they're going to push back. And I think that's a big piece of this. You really should involve people a lot earlier than really feels comfortable as a leader.
Yeah, it requires so much discipline, right? As an executive or even kind of the middle managers who are having to execute, the change that they may or may not have helped get to conceive that strategy. So it's a matter of like really, really diving in on recognizing change management and being very, very judicious about not overloading, right? So I keep saying this, it's the pace of the change, it's not necessarily the change, right? So you have to sit down and sequence out events, not just stack them because either we're excited or the new executives got the pressure or is putting the pressure on you. Like you have to figure out how to manage to your priorities. And one of the things we started doing in my organization fairly recently was, again, this took a lot of discipline because we needed to get some stuff done, but building recovery periods after big pushes. And if you can show, the organization, here is the actual map we're going to use. Here are some places we might check and adjust, but here is how this is going to, probably go. And you'll see we have built in some periods of just recovery and rest on this. I think people calm down a little bit more because they can sort of manage their emotions around what's coming. Somebody said something at the last symposium, Garrett, that I wrote down, which was people do not resist change, they resist confusion. So again, this goes back to just being as clear as you can with the timing, the actual change, and the reasoning behind the change to begin with.
Yeah,
It takes so much discipline. It's really hard.
I have recently I took on a position where I was taking over for a previous director and had to essentially change everything we were doing in that place. And my my boss, who's in charge of everything, he kept saying to me, "He's like, you got to calm down. You have to like pull back. You have to slow down." Because I'm intensely a guy that just wants to push, 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 push all the time. And so I had to sort of model that restraint as a leader, just to show the rest of the management team that there was, even though I was fresh here, that we could slow down a little bit, but also there's aspects that are requirements to change. Like, we are a very customer focused organization, and we live or die on our customer service feedback in a lot of ways, right? And so we not only are getting pressure from the top to move fast, but also pressure from our customers that we need to make these changes happen. And a lot of times we treat this chaos as a almost like a normalization, right? Like of us having to buy into the chaos and to choose to have the faster time, the longer hours than it's required. And I've said a lot of times that people don't get up in the morning and say, "Man, I really hope I'm going to be bad at my job today," right? But we train them to do that because we want to push all the time. And there has to be a balance, right? I think there's definitely aspirations of speed, but by modeling the restraint, especially early on, because really the first 100 days is where you get the most effective amount of change, really. But that's why we talk about it when it comes to a presidency, right? That first 100 days, why it's so important. But taking the time to learn from not only your peers, but also learn more about the business and have that restraint to understand for the first 30, 60, 90 days, to really understand what the business is doing, what the goals and objectives of that business are, really will allow you to move and shift to a position of having to have that restraint so you can move forward with a really well-devised plan. And on that note, a lot of the times building up small, and I think to Amanda's point, really building up these sort of small contracts with their, small movements equal large movements, right? So building on all of that as well. And that gives you time to really formalize what the plan is if you model that restraint.
I agree with you, Dean and Susie, on a couple of those points. And I think that we get caught up often as leaders that we think that moving fast equals good leadership, and it doesn't, right? The clarity is always going to beat speed, because if you do something too fast and there's confusion, to Suzanne's point, that's what exhausts teams.
Right.
So clarity is kind, right? And being really clear on why, again, what does it mean for me and what does success look like? That's impactful to reduce the confusion. And again, as leaders, it doesn't look, we move very fast. We're an agency, we move super, super fast. But sometimes, again, moving fast doesn't equal good. So, taking a step back sometimes as leaders is really key. But, to Suzanne's point, confusion, that is really what is exhausting to teams, is where we go, who owns this now, or just the changing of goals. Sometimes when you're making changes so quickly, it does really truly create confusion.
Yeah, we say all the time in my organization, you can have it fast, you can have it good, but you can't have it both.
So this is really interesting, though, because we're kind of speaking out both sides of our mouth on this. And I agree with both of you, by the way. But one of my mentors said, I think you mentioned this, Dean, that like it's really important to just come in as a leader and listen and absorb for 30, 60, 90 days. My mentor always said 90 days you do nothing, but you do lose a lot of momentum there, right? And the first impressions count. And I have not yet, just in true vulnerability, found a good way to balance my enthusiasm and momentum with being thoughtful and quiet, And so if you guys have any advice for me on that, I'd love to hear it here.
Because you do have new jobs promote new energy, right? So like you get this new role or whatever you're doing, and you have a lot of energy around it, and you just want to go. And that was the challenge that I kept fighting, right? Is that I wanted to go because not only that, but I wanted to build trust within the environment of the group, right? There was a lot of broken trust with that group. There was a lot of faulty leadership that was causing them to not trust not only their leadership structure, but not just the business as a whole. one of the things that I did with this particular position that I did that's contradictory to everything I've ever done before, because usually I would just ignore the precept and just jam on as fast as I could anyways, right? And this particular one, I think a lot of it just had to do with writing the book on empathy, was to think about the cognitive workload that these folks were under with these types of change, take that time. And then when I was ready, I sat down and I had an all hands meeting where I basically listed out what the first 100 days was going to look like. As to say, the first 90 days of me being here was really just, in a sense, where me learning how things worked. But today is when the first 100 starts, right?
Oh,
meeting.
so you just reset the clock.
Exactly. I mean, as the leader, right, we get to make that decision, right? We
Yeah.
get to say to ourselves, hey, we get to determine when the pace starts. And so by having that meeting and saying, this is day one of the first 100 days, these are the things we're going to lay out. These are the challenges that we're facing. You're right. In a sense, that's a really great way to put it, is I reset the clock and said, no, today is the first day of my organization and what it looks like. And that really helped. It really set the tone and the pace. And we go into 2026 with a lot of goals and objectives that I don't think would have been there had I just had my sort of arrogant blinders on of just moving as fast as I could possibly do it and ignoring all the people around me saying slow down. So
Yeah, I would imagine that also just really balanced. This is again a thing I struggle with a little bit, is learning how to lead with empathy, but also be decisive with it, right? And they're not mutually exclusive of each other necessarily, but you just sort of have to figure out where in this push for change, where you're going to land kind of as a leader, and what kind of a culture you're trying to establish. But I really like this whole resetting piece of it. That resonates with me. Thank you.
So, y'all are bringing up this really great point. We're talking about, we've talked about a couple of things. We talked about how we can set expectations for our direct reports when we're implementing change. We've talked about how we can set expectations for ourselves when we're in a leadership role. Let's talk about managing up, because I think that's the other part that we're missing here. And somebody said this in an executive symposium last year, but the number one job of a board member is to not lose their board member seat. And so if that's the case, proposing change is very, very conducive to keeping your board member seat. And so you're not thinking about the ramifications of what it means to the people who are actually implementing the work. You're not actually in the day-to-day of the operations as to what they're going through anyways. So it's very easy for a board member to sit back and be like, let's implement AI. Let's do this. Let's do that, regardless of whether or not it makes sense for the business. And so, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but there is this kind of notion of how secure we are in our position, especially as a new employee. We typically want to be like, they brought us in, we're going to do what we said we were going to do. And, a secure leader is able to truly sit back and wait that 90 days and reset the clock, like Dean, you had mentioned. But a lot of leaders don't have that kind of discipline, especially when they build up in their head what they think the ramifications are of waiting that first 90 days to then start taking it in and making that change. Oftentimes you get a little antsy. You get a little antsy in your pantsy and you think, I got to be making these moves now. And I guess for us as leaders in an organization, if we observe a new C-suite executive getting brought onto the team, and that person is getting a little antsy with the changes, ready to jump in, what is your advice for managing up to these new C-suite leaders that, might be prematurely jumping at a change that you're like, whoa, 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 let's just take a little bit, couple more breaths, like wait it out. You're going to observe the culture a little bit better without, losing your job, without, getting onto a bad foot with the person. What are your advice? What's your suggestion for managing up?
I got to tell you, this might be a little bit of a hot take in this situation, but
Please.
I try to, first of all, it starts before I even get the job, whether or not this is going to be a good fit for me, right? Because I know how I operate, I know how I manage. And if I get into a situation where the C-suite is very much top down, micro focused on every little thing we're doing, it may not be a good fit for me, because I tend to be a little bit more strained, especially as I've gotten older, right? Talk to me when I was in my 20s. It's a different story than when I am now. But I think that's part of it. The other part of it too is that Here's the hot take part. Like at the end of the day, it's not my business, right? It is up to the board of directors and the C-suite to make those types of decisions. And at the end of the day, if I've created you know, an agreement with them that I'm going to come in and I'm going to help them run their business, communicating up and saying, hey, there are some ramifications to some of these decisions that you're making, and this is what I think it is, but they just sort of supersede that and ignore it and just move on. You're obligated to take care of those things. And to a certain extent, while it, to be perfectly blunt, it sucks, that's what you signed on for. And I see a lot of people in my position that they get so frustrated with the people above them and making these decisions, whether they be short-term goals with, with no gains or no focus change or whatever they perceive to be the thing. My advice always back to them is you're the one that's able to make a change in that situation. You can either decide to get on board and do the thing. Maybe there's something to be learned from that, but you also can make that decision to not be part of that business anymore if you so choose. And that's really a struggle point, right? And I certainly have struggled with my time is sometimes I just have to eat it and go do the job because I love the paycheck. But there's other times when I can make the decision that maybe for me, this isn't the right environment for me to be in. Yeah, so I don't know. It's definitely a struggle. I try to be open and communicative and tell people this is what I think are the problems, and I think this is where the pitfalls may be. But at the end of the day, it doesn't say Dean Bruce Inc. on the sign. So to a certain extent, I kind of need to do what they tell me to do.
Dean, there's also the third option in those categories where it's like you can either get on board with the change, you can determine this is not the right company for you, or where I think a lot of people fall into is the verbally yes, actual practice maybe, no, I don't know, trudge along, see if they notice, and play a
Yeah,
little Russian roulette with your job and see if you
yeah.
can build a
I mean, I will tell you, being a guy that spent most of his youth cutting teeth in management by being that guy, I will tell you that ultimately you alienate a lot of people that you kind of need help with later on in life as you try to like look for other opportunities or I mean, one of the people that I'll be honest with you has probably been my chief mentor. We've worked together twice in our careers, and all the times he's been my boss. But and every time we argue like we're siblings, right? Like we really get down and dirty about things that we don't like. But at the end of the day, I always tell him, like, you're the guy that's in charge, so I'm going to do what you want to do. But if it hadn't been for having some folks like that understood that I was just going to gripe about it, but also be mature enough to see it as an opportunity to teach me the political aspect of running being part of a business, and I use air quotes for because we all know there's a political game to it, right? Um, I caution about being too rough because then you become that guy that is that rough patch all the time, and people are saying, well, maybe we don't want to work with him anymore, or maybe we want to, maybe we should put him in a corner. I've seen plenty of people get put into a Siberian sort of job where they're not talked to anymore, right? Because they have some value to the business, but talking to other people ain't that value, right? And so yeah, you're right. There is definitely a third option. I took it for a long time, but speaking 20 years in the future from that, I don't know that I would suggest it too often.
Well, I'm not saying you suggest it. I'm just speaking of the reality of the situation
for
is
sure.
that a lot of people fall into that bucket. But
Well,
yeah,
that's why we get this whole aspect of silently quitting, right? Like this idea that like you're just gonna go and do the thing, and you're not going to be emotionally attached to it, and you're not going to. I mean, there's all these aspects to it, but I really try to stress to my staff every day, like I get it. You don't come to work to be bad at your job. Let's find a way to really focus in where your talent is and how that can be beneficial to the business. There's certainly aspects of what I do that isn't beneficial to the business. Not a lot of people react well to a leader that really wants to be focused on the cognitive load and the breaking down of emotional status within the construct of a business. They don't really care. They just want to run the business. But at the same time, it's necessary, right? We got to be mindful and smart about those things. So, but it's a good point, Garrett. I mean, there's always a third road, right?
I think that managing up is kind of an interesting thing because it kind of depends on what up means, right? I have three bosses. Amanda is a business owner. Dean's got something else going on. So I think to me, really the only thing that sort of transfers over all of those is what Amanda keeps saying, which is educate them on what's in it for them. Whoever that person is, whatever their objectives to that organization are. If you need someone to calm down, there's a lot of ways to say that. something you guys don't know necessarily is Amanda and I have been friends for more years than I'm willing to admit on a live stream. But Amanda has told me to calm down a whole lot in our the course of our relationship, both personal and professional. But she's always been able to exactly explain why that enthusiasm might be misplaced in that moment, which is one of the reasons we're such great friends. But it just really kind of depends on, I think there's a lot there. That's a really loaded question in terms of each specific dynamic to whom you're managing up to.
I do think one of the biggest mistakes some new leaders make are they feel like they're supposed to step in and have all the answers, and they really should just be asking a lot of questions,
Mhm.
especially when they're new in their role, and just understanding what problems has leadership already tried to solve here, and just that understanding. I love the first 90 days of just listening and asking questions. Um, I believe that that is a good leader. If someone's coming in and they don't know all the things yet and they're trying to tell a team what to do, I would take that as a massive red flag.
How do you role play? Can we role play, I guess? What does that conversation look like? Because they're still your boss. Like I'm looking for like a tangible example that if I'm a viewer of this and I'm thinking to myself like, okay, I'm the chief operating officer and I got a new CEO that the board's recently appointed, or I'm a VP and I got a new chief growth officer who now I report to, or whatever. I'm just making up an example, but point I'm getting at is like if I have a new boss and I'm still a leader myself, but they're my boss, what is a effective way to go about having that conversation that can kind of like help them see the forest from the trees? Does that question make sense? Does anybody want to give a stab at it and giving a
I mean, I think the first thing you've got to really do is you got to understand where they're coming from, right? Like want to, I always assume positive intent, right? So I'm never one of those people that just goes, it's new boss, everything's going to break down and everything's going to erode. For all we know, everything's going to get great. Maybe there's some deficiencies in the business that this person is going to solve for. So taking the time to understand where they're coming from and what changes they're trying to affect in is certainly helpful, especially if they practice, like we've talked about, some restraint and understanding the business and things like that. But then the other aspect of this that I try to do is, for example, whatever the task is or whatever the thing is, they come to us and say, we need to do this. And maybe I don't agree with it, right? Maybe there's 15 different reasons why I don't agree with it. I try to go back to them and say, listen, I see where you're coming from. I absolutely can get on board with that, but let's understand a couple of things that are going to change in the way that we do business. And you also need to understand who your leadership is. Are they a metrics based, owner? Are they a thought leader, right? Are they really focused on the customer sats, all the emotional aspects of and then come at them meet them where they are on that. So if it's a metrics driven person, you sort of say, hey, this is the adverse effect that we see calculable on cost to ownership on these particular things, or this is the erosion of the staff that we may see, or the CSAT erosion we may see when we make these changes. And so I try to balance it by just giving more information about where that decision may take us. And then ultimately we execute on it and we see if how it affects everything overall. So
I think that's a good call out, Dean. I feel like managing up for me specifically with my clients, right? I'm dealing with CHROs or VPs of TA. For me, it's about anchoring ideas to outcomes. What's measurable? What does success look like? Because if we can't agree on that before we start something, then we're not going to get very far. I might think something is extremely successful by my metrics, but if we're not aligned on what that is, then we're completely going to miss each other. So for me, it's really that alignment and that provides credibility, really. Like if you're aligned, you understand what we're measuring, what success looks like collectively, then we can actually then measure it and determine, okay, let's pilot this with one team first and measure success before we launch it with this whole division or with the whole company.
Which is a really interesting thing because, obviously we have to measure results. You essentially are going to get what you pay for in a sense. But I think there are some hard to measure metrics that we need to keep in mind. This isn't so much managing up as managing down and across, but especially in times of change, I think you also have to know what success looks like and recognize efforts and not just like the results in the way we think of them as financial metrics or CSAT or whatever, right? So like celebrating adaptability or learning or, extra effort. I think that that goes a really long way kind of across the organization. So yeah, I would just encourage all of us to keep those sort of softies in there when we're talking about what does success look like. Because I agree with you, Amanda. I think it's really, really important. But I think sometimes we start measuring only what the P&L is going to show and not so much these things that are kind of inherent to successful change management.
That's a good call out, Suzanne. I think it's a really fascinating point. I think like as a leader, what does success look like in the effort it took to get there? Like, let's say you're targeting a new market, a new demographic, and you've got a hypothesis as to how effective you're going to be targeting this new market. And you put on a new sales leader or person to, run after that market. And they've worked their butt off. I mean, they've been going at it, hitting the grindstone, shaking hands, kissing babies, doing all the things you're supposed to do to try to close deals. But for better or for worse, they're not successful. They're not able to do it, even though they've been successful in other markets. So it's not them. Maybe it's the market segment. And just saying like, hey, I know you've worked your butt off and I want to acknowledge that versus just saying, hey, this was a big giant failure and you messed up and now we're going to pull back. And they're thinking to themselves like, great, if you're going to put me on a new change initiative, I'm not going to work nearly as hard as I worked on this because I didn't get acknowledged at all. Get it from a business standpoint, it failed, but for better or for worse, I was the you know, new science experiment. I was the new elixir in the potion that tried to see if a new change would happen from this sort of scenario. And so I think acknowledging that is huge. One other point I wanted to bring up, and this is a lot along lines of what like Dean and Amanda were talking about, and I'd be curious to learn what all your thoughts are on this, but anchoring ideas to outcomes, practicing curiosity, I think that makes a lot of sense especially when you're managing up to just kind of get a better idea as to why a certain change is being implemented. But I want to bring up a reality of the scenario is that from whether it be an empathy perspective or I don't know, the pressure that person might be feeling is not the same amount of pressure that you might be feeling. And so you might feel secure in your standing within the organization and ask curious questions to better understand. But if they flip off the handle because they're like, are you an idiot? What do you mean you don't understand why we're implementing this change? By the way, I'm not saying any of us would do any of that, but there are leaders out there that do that. And they're maybe unaware of the psychological safety that tarnishes when you flip out at somebody. And, some people characterize it like hard leadership or tough love or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, it causes people to not feel comfortable bringing up any challenges to you because that's the culture it's building. Do you have any ways to help overcome people who are like that, or do you just determine, screw it, this isn't worth my time?
I will lead this off by saying that I was in that position for a while recently, and being a guy that just grinds it out as hard as he can, no matter what the situation is, I was left in a position where I realized I just couldn't grind it out anymore, and ultimately made the decision to leave. And at the end of the day, I left with some good knowledge, especially from the person that was causing all this, and some focus. But really, it made me focus on what was important to me as a leader, and what was important for me to show to my employees. And at the end of the day, the business goals for that business and my personal goals were not in alignment. And so it was best for me to depart, and mostly because I was just going to become a detriment to the business to a certain extent, right? And like I say, I go back to the fact that like it's not my business. So and I had a very long conversation and said, listen, I feel like I'm just going to be an impedance in what you guys are trying to do because we're never going to be aligned, and ultimately left. And now I'm in a position where I'm very much aligned with the business and very much aligned all the way up the leadership structure. But that took some time, and really had to focus on what was important to me. And honestly, what was important to me over the last year changed pretty dramatically to the previous 10 years, 15 years of my career, right? I really wanted to be at that quick, agile, go get them, don't worry about the toxicity of aggressive management. And to a point now where I'm a little bit older and I'm like, I'm really solely focused on making sure I work in a good environment And it's not necessarily about the salary perspective, right? It's about making sure that I'm working in a place that aligns well with who I am as a person and that treats everyone with respect, so that when I'm taking a few moments to deal with an employee that's having an emotional distressed moment, I have the ability to take that time, and there isn't somebody behind me going, well, that person isn't effective as they were last week. And so yeah, so for me it was the easiest. I pulled the ripcord and left. Maybe not the most classy way to do it, but it was the best way to solve it for me. So
Yeah, I think from experience having managers in the past that were kind of their way or the highway, that causes burnout, right? So when leaders stop listening, their teams feel it immediately. They don't like it, right? It becomes very disconnected. When there's no feedback, leadership confidence just feels performative, right? Confidence is really great, but pretending like you're never unsure is completely exhausting as a leader. So I can't imagine being that type of leader. But I feel like that is when burnout happens, when you have that. Dean, you just said it yourself. You left the organization because of that. And that's what happens when you have those types of leaders.
For those of you who've never experienced those types of leaders, if you want a really funny example, it's not necessarily a leadership example, but have you all seen the TV show Arrested Development?
mhm.
Yeah.
So not Michael Bluth, but the grandpa, the old guy that started the business and everything. What he would always say to his kids, like when they'd want to run the business or start anything new or change anything, he'd always say, "What are you taking, stupid pills? Come on." I know that sounds silly, and it's a very funny TV show if you've never seen the TV show, but that's a perfect example of how you create toxicity and psychological insecurity, whether it be in a family or in a business unit, is by doing stuff like that, of flying off the handle when anybody proposes any curiosity, not a challenge, just curiosity to your ideas, or saying, "What are you taking, stupid pills?" Uh, it's a joke, but it's actually pretty toxic and
Yeah,
not.
I've tried to, as best I can, to create an environment where I run into this all the time, especially because a lot of the people that work for me are engineers. I run into this environment all the time where they're so afraid to make a mistake because they're gonna get yelled at for it. And I always tell them, like, listen, it's not about the mistake, it's about what you do to resolve the mistake that really matters the most to me. Because we're all gonna make mistakes, we're all gonna screw up. I've screwed up 10 times this morning, right? Like, and there's no way to like solve that problem other than to just get better at solving the problem. And you're right, Garrett, it's like, to a certain extent, there's a lot of leaders out there that will look at that situation and go, well, how were you stupid enough to make that mistake? And the reality is, it's like that just erodes behavior. And before you know it, you've got a bunch of people making a lot of stupid mistakes every single day, and they're getting more and more frustrated by it, and you're getting more and more frustrated by it, and the cycle just continues. Whereas at certain times, if you just stopped and said, listen, it's fine, it's okay. Like I've said this before, we're not launching rockets into the atmosphere. Like, we're not trying to cure cancer. We're just helping people try to make sure the computer is just a little bit better than it was yesterday. All right. So how do we do that for them in the most effective, clean way possible? And again, when you come at it with a little bit of care and understanding, and you start to see people soften up a little bit, and the mistakes are less and less, right? Because they go, well, I did make a mistake, but I solved it. Like, the best part of my day is when somebody comes to me and goes, hey boss, I made this mistake. The customer was like, this is the situation, but I was able to fix it and I did X, Y, and Z. Is that okay? And I always say yes. I almost 99.9% of the time I just go, yes, that's perfect, because you tried to solve the problem, right? And that to me speaks
Yeah.
more volumes of them than anything else.
And it's not just erosion of kind of trust, right? If you don't let your teams fail forward, it's an erosion of performance, because then they're going to hide mistakes from you.
Right.
You know what I mean? If they're not being asked to take accountability for it because they're terrified, you get in a lot bigger situations with that. So yeah, we're a big fail forward culture.
Fail fast, fail forward. Absolutely.
Yes.
You're going to make mistakes. It happens. And when you're raked over the coals for it, then you're certainly going to hide it the next time, right?
Yeah, because I do take a lot of stupid pills every day, so it's helpful to have somebody to help me through that. So
Cool. Dean, Suzanne, Amanda, this has been a great pre-symposium panel. If you're watching this and you're thinking, I want to meet these three great leaders, come to our executive symposium on February 12th. I'll post the link on how to RSVP in the comments of this. But Dean, Suzanne, Amanda,